The invitation nobody expected at night was quiet, but Sundar Pichai's phone buzzed with a notification that felt strangely out of place. It wasn't from Google, it wasn't from a family member, and it wasn't one of the hundreds of emails he received every day. It was a gold-trimmed digital envelope, the kind used for exclusive events that most people never even hear about. The sender's name glared at the bottom. Arthur Kane, one of the richest and most flamboyant billionaires in the world. Arthur was known for hosting over-the-top parties where politicians, celebrities, and business tycoons mingled under chandeliers that cost more than entire houses. Sundar had never been invited before. The message was short, almost careless. You're welcome to join us this Saturday. Dress code, legendary. Sundar stared at it for a while, his fingers hovering over the screen. He knew Arthur's reputation, charming to the cameras, ruthless in private. His events weren't just social gatherings. They were arenas for power games, subtle humiliations, and unspoken challenges. Sundar wondered why the sudden invitation. It didn't feel like an honor, it felt like bait. Over the years, he had learned that in certain circles, some invitations weren't about friendship at all. They were tests, or worse, jokes. He remembered reading about how Arthur once invited a low-profile inventor just to ridicule his outdated suit in front of guests. Sundar couldn't shake the thought that maybe he was being set up for something similar. 2 days before the event, Sundar's assistant confirmed the details. It's black tie, sir. The guest list includes high-profile tech rivals, movie stars, oil magnates, even royalty. She hesitated, then added, I've heard Arthur sometimes uses these events to make people perform, like a stage. Sundar smiled faintly, though there was no real humor in it. I'm not here to perform for anyone, he said quietly. Still, a flicker of curiosity ran through him. He knew that walking into that party could mean walking straight into a trap. But a part of him wanted to see why the invitation had come in the first place on the day of the party. The city seemed unusually alive. Streets were lined with luxury cars heading in the same direction to Arthur Kane's infamous estate, a sprawling property that could be seen from miles away, glowing like a palace under the night sky. Sundar didn't take a limousine or a sports car. Instead, he arrived in a modest, classic black sedan, the kind most people wouldn't even glance at. As he stepped out, he was wearing a tailored dark suit, simple but elegant, and a watch his father had given him decades ago. Nothing flashy, nothing screaming for attention. But there was something about the way he carried himself, calm and steady, that made a few onlookers pause inside. The air was heavy with perfume, laughter, and the clink of crystal glasses. Chandeliers sparkled overhead and waiters moved through. The crowd carrying trays of food so delicately arranged it looked more like art than dinner. Arthur Kane stood at the center, dressed in a white tuxedo with a gold bow tie, surrounded by people hanging on his every word. When he saw Sundar, his eyebrows lifted just slightly, as if surprised he had actually shown up. Sundar, he said loudly, his voice carrying over the music. You made it. I wasn't sure you'd fit in. The pause after "you'd" was deliberate, the kind that invited quiet chuckles from his circle. Sundar shook his hand politely, ignoring the veiled jab. Thank you for inviting me, he said, his voice warm but measured. He didn't need to match Arthur's theatrics. He knew his calmness was its own form of strength. Still, he could feel the glances, some curious, some mocking, as if people were waiting for him to slip, to be awkward, to give them a story to laugh about later. As the evening went on, the conversations became more pointed. Someone asked Sundar if he ever got tired of being the nice guy in an industry of sharks. Another leaned in and said, So, do you actually know how to have fun? Or is this your first time at a real party? It was subtle, but Sundar recognized the pattern. This was the setup. They wanted to test his composure, to see if they could make him feel out of place. But he listened, smiled, and redirected every jab into a thoughtful, almost disarming reply. Then came the moment. Arthur clinked his glass, drawing everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, as you know, I like to honor my guests in unique ways. Tonight, I thought we'd play a little game. I call it Prove Your Legend. A murmur went through the crowd. Arthur turned to Sundar with a mischievous grin. Since our dear Sundar is here, why don't we start with him? Tell us, Sundar, what's the most legendary thing you've ever done that wasn't about money or business? The room fell silent. It wasn't a simple question. It was a trap. Everyone expected him to hesitate, stumble, or give some dull answer that would make him seem boring. Compared to the flashy crowd, Sundar looked around slowly, his eyes meeting those of people who clearly doubted him. He took a sip of water, set the glass down, and leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. I could tell you about business, he began, but the most legendary thing I've ever done happened in a small village, far away from all this. The crowd leaned in, sensing something unexpected. Sundar's tone had changed, quieter, more intimate, but with a weight that demanded attention. He began to speak about a moment from his past. Something personal, something few people knew about. The room seemed to shrink around him, the music fading as everyone waited for the next words. And just as the story was about to unfold, a loud voice interrupted from the back. A man laughing, saying, "Oh, come on, this isn't a charity dinner, Sundar. Give us something real." Sundar turned his head toward the man, his expression unreadable. The pause stretched, and the tension in the air was sharp enough to cut. And then Sundar stood up from his seat. Asterisk the silence before the storm moment. Sundar rose from his seat. The chatter in the room died completely. It wasn't loud before, but now is nothing but stillness. All eyes followed him, as if something unpredictable was about to happen. The man who had mocked him, tall, broad-shouldered, with the smug grin of someone used to winning attention, leaned back in his chair, confident that he had struck a nerve. Arthur Kane, sipping champagne, looked mildly amused, like a director watching a scene he thought he had written. Sundar didn't speak right away. Instead, he placed both hands lightly on the back of his chair, his eyes moving from one face to another, as if weighing the worth of each gaze. His voice, when it came, was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, something that told people he wasn't going to let this moment pass as they had expected. You asked for something real, Sundar said, locking eyes with the man in the back. Real doesn't always glitter. It doesn't always make the news. And it's not always meant for applause. He took a step forward, not toward the man who had mocked him, but toward the center of the room where the light from the chandelier made his face stand out. The most legendary thing I've ever done was not on a stage like this, not in a boardroom, and certainly not in a place where people were looking for entertainment. It was in a village where the only light came from a single kerosene lamp, and the only sound was the cough of a child who hadn't eaten in 2 days. The crowd shifted slightly. Some exchanged looks, perhaps uncomfortable. A woman in a red dress leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, drawn in despite herself. Sundar's voice slowed, drawing them closer. I had gone there because of a promise I made when I was young, he continued. A promise to myself that one day, if I ever had the means, I would go back to the kind of place where I came from, to a school like the one I attended, where a single book was shared by 10 children, and where dreams were smaller not because they wanted them to be, but because no one had ever told them they could be bigger. He paused, letting the words sink in. That night, there was a boy sitting on the floor, holding a broken pencil so tightly you'd think it was made of gold. He told me he couldn't write his exam because the pencil wasn't sharp enough, and there was no sharpener in the hole. School. There was a soft murmur among the guests. The man who had interrupted earlier crossed his arms, smirking, but Sundar didn't look at him again. Instead, his eyes moved to the far side of the room where a waiter stood frozen, tray in hand, listening as though he, too, had been pulled into the story. I took that pencil, Sundar said, and sharpened it with a small pocket knife. I always carry. The boy smiled like I had given him the world. Later, I found out he had topped the district in his exams. And years later, when I returned, he was the headmaster of that same school. Sundar's voice softened. That is what I call legendary. Not because it was my act, but because it showed me that the smallest things we do can outlive us in ways we'd never imagine. The room was quiet, but the quiet was different now. It wasn't the cold silence from before. It was the kind that happens when people are afraid to break a moment that feels too genuine. Arthur Kane's smirk had faded into something unreadable, a mix of curiosity and something else, perhaps even respect. But the man in the back wasn't ready to let it go. Touching, he said sarcastically, slow clapping. So you sharpen pencils now? Maybe next you'll tell us how you built a school out of matchsticks. A few nervous chuckles followed, but they were weaker this time, as if the crowd wasn't entirely on his side anymore. Sundar turned toward him, and for the first time, a flicker of steel flashed in his eyes. You think power is about the size of your bank account? He said, his voice low but carrying. I think it's about the size of your impact. One fades when the market changes. The other lasts generations. Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the room's energy change. Sundar glanced toward him. Arthur, you invited me here tonight, he said, and I came because I believe conversations like this matter. But I didn't come to compete for applause or approval. He let the words settle for a beat before adding, sometimes the most important audience is the one you don't see, the people who remember you long after you've left the room. The man in the back opened his mouth as if to respond, but before he could, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the hall. Everyone turned. One of the waiters had dropped a tray, and the sound had startled more than a few guests. The waiter, a young man in his 20s, bent quickly to pick up the shattered pieces, his hands trembling. Sundar's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. Something about the young man's face, pale, nervous, almost panicked, caught his attention. Arthur waved dismissively. Don't worry about that. We'll have someone clean it up. But Sundar didn't sit back down. Instead, he walked across the room, his polished shoes making almost no sound on the marble floor. Guests whispered to each other, unsure why. He was leaving the spotlight. He knelt beside the young waiter and quietly asked, Are you okay? The young man nodded quickly, but his eyes darted away. Sundar noticed a small cut on his hand from the glass, and without a word, he took a handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it gently. It was a simple gesture, but the room had gone silent. Again, this time, not out of tension, but out of something that felt like realization. They had come to watch a spectacle, and instead, they were watching something real. But just as Sundar was about to stand, the young man whispered something so quietly that Sundar almost missed it. Sir, I know you, the waiter said. I need your help. It's about my sister. Sundar's brow furrowed. Your sister? He asked softly. The young man's eyes flicked nervously toward Arthur Kane, then back to Sundar. Please, not here, he whispered. They'll hear. Sundar felt the weight of the moment settle over him. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a spilled tray or a party game. And he knew right then that the real reason he had been invited to this party might not be the one he thought. Asterisk whispers in the shadows. Music had resumed. But for Sundar, it felt distant, almost hollow, like background noise in a dream. The young waiter's eyes were darting from side to side, as though every chandelier and every guest might be a pair of ears listening in. Sundar kept his voice low, calm, and steady, the way one does when approaching a frightened animal. Tell me your name, he said softly. The waiter hesitated before replying. Nathan, he whispered. His voice cracked slightly, as if even saying his own name was a risk in this room. Sundar nodded slowly, not pushing too fast. All right, Nathan, he murmured. You said it's about your sister. Where is she now? Nathan's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. She's here, he said, his voice so faint Sundar almost thought he imagined it. But not as a guest. His eyes flicked toward the far end of the hall, where a narrow hallway led toward the back of the estate. Sundar followed the glance, noticing for the first time a group of staff disappearing into the shadows there, carrying trays toward what he assumed was the kitchen. Arthur Kane's voice suddenly rang out again, calling for attention to the next game of the evening, and laughter bubbled up around the room. Sundar glanced back at the main crowd and then at Nathan. "Stay close to me," Sundar whispered, "but act like you're just doing your job." He stood up slowly, blending back into the flow of the party. Guests drifted around him, some still buzzing from his earlier story, others trying to read his expression. Arthur caught his eye from across the room, raising his glass in a gesture. That could have been either friendliness or warning. Sundar gave a polite nod, but his mind was already turning over possibilities. Nathan moved quietly through the crowd, carrying an empty tray to avoid suspicion, occasionally stopping to pick up discarded glasses. Sundar followed at a casual distance, his posture relaxed, but his focus razor sharp. He had attended enough corporate events to know that sometimes the real deals, or the real damage, happened far from the main stage as they reached the hallway. The noise of the party began to fade, replaced by the faint hum of industrial refrigerators and the smell of cooking food. Staff members moved in quick, efficient patterns, hardly glancing up. Nathan slipped into a narrow side door and gestured for Sundar to follow. Inside was a small storage room lined with shelves of supplies, linen, bottled water, unopened boxes. Nathan closed the door softly behind them. His hands were shaking now, not from carrying trays, but from whatever was weighing on him. "She works in the house," he began, his words spilling out in urgent whisper. "Not just tonight. She's here all the time. Cleaning, doing laundry, running errands. But it's not right, sir." Sundar's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "She can't leave. They don't let her. She came here for a job, but they took her passport. They say she owes them for bringing her here, for food, for the room she sleeps in. But it's not a room, it's a storage closet with a mattress. And if she talks about leaving..." His voice broke, and he looked away, his eyes wet. "They threaten her." A cold heaviness settled in Sundar's chest. The glittering chandeliers of the party suddenly felt grotesque, mocking. "Who's they?" He asked, though a part of him already suspected the answer. Nathan hesitated, glancing at the door as if expecting it to burst open. "Arthur's head of staff. His name's Clive. But I think Arthur knows. Maybe not every detail, but enough to look the other way." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. Sundar thought back to Arthur's casual dismissal when the tray had dropped. The way he'd waved it off without a second glance at the people who made the party possible. Nathan took a shaky breath. "Sir, I asked for your help because I've seen what you've done for people. I know you don't need to be here. But if you could just talk to her, maybe, I don't know, find a way to get her out." He stopped suddenly, his face going pale. Footsteps, heavy ones, coming down the hallway toward the storage room. Nathan single quotes. S eyes went wide. He mouthed one word. "Live." The door handle rattled. In an instant. Sundar's mind raced. Leaving would draw attention. Staying meant confrontation. He glanced at Nathan, who looked like he was bracing for impact. The door swung open, and the man who stepped inside looked exactly like the kind of person you'd expect to enforce control in a place like this. Tall, broad, with a neatly pressed uniform and a gaze that scanned the room like a searchlight. His eyes landed on Nathan first, then shifted to Sundar. "Mr. Pichai," he said with a stiff, almost mocking formality. "Didn't expect to find you back here. Guests usually stay in the main hall." Sundar gave a polite but neutral smile. "I was just speaking with your colleague here," he said evenly. "He was telling me about his work." Clive's smile was thin and sharp. "Well, Nathan has work to do, lots of glasses to clear." His tone carried a weight, the kind that left no room for refusal. Nathan glanced helplessly at Sundar, his lips pressed tight, before slipping past Clive and disappearing into the hall. Clive stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "You seem like a smart man," Mr. Pichai. So I'll say this once. Stay in the main hall. This part of the house isn't for you. He left without waiting for an answer, shutting the door firmly behind him. Sundar stood there for a long moment, the quiet pressing in on him. He knew now that this party was no accident, and the reason for his invitation might have been to keep him in plain sight while something darker happened in the shadows. But Sundar also knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stay. In the main hall, ** whispers in the shadows. Music from the grand hall still floated faintly in the air. But it felt far away now, muffled, like a memory half forgotten. Sundar could see that Nathan's hands were trembling slightly, his knuckles pale from gripping the edge of his empty tray. His eyes were restless, scanning the room as if every ornate wall and glittering chandelier might be hiding someone who was watching them. Take a breath, Sundar said quietly, his tone warm but deliberate, the kind of voice meant to steady nerves. Now, tell me what's going on. Nathan licked his lip, hesitating. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. It's about my sister, sir. She's here tonight. But not like these people. He glanced toward the crowd of laughing, jeweled guests in the main room. She works here. Not just for the party. She's here all the time. In the house? Sundar asked. * Nathan nodded, his eyes dropping. Yes, cleaning, laundry, errands. Anything they tell her to do. She came here thinking it was a good job, something steady. But the moment she arrived, they took her passport. Said she owed them for bringing her here, for the food, for the bed she sleeps on. But the bed, his voice cracked slightly. It's just a thin mattress on the floor of a storage room. No windows. They tell her she can't leave until she's paid them back. But every time she works, they say it's still not enough. Sundar felt a deep heaviness settle in his chest. The laughter from the main hall now sounded hollow, almost cruel. Who is it? He asked, keeping his voice steady but his eyes sharp. Nathan's jaw tightened. The head of staff. His name's Clive. He runs everything behind the scenes. The workers, the schedules, the security. But Nathan's gaze flicked nervously toward the open doorway. I think Arthur knows. Maybe not all the details, but enough to stop it if he wanted, and he doesn't. That last sentence hung in the air like smoke, bitter and suffocating. Sundar glanced toward the main hall, where Arthur's laughter rose above the music like the confident bark of a man who believed the world was his stage. Does your sister want to leave? Sundar asked, thought Nathan's single quotes as answer was instant. Yes. She's terrified. But she's afraid if she says anything, though. His voice dropped even lower. They've made threats before. She believes them. There was a stillness in the small pocket of space they occupied, as if time itself was holding its breath. Sundar knew that moments like this were dangerous, not just for the people trapped in them, but for anyone who decided to get involved. But he also knew he could never unhear what Nathan had just told him. Where is she now? Sundar asked. Nathan glanced toward a narrow hallway that led away from the main event. Downstairs. They keep the house staff out of sight during the party unless they're serving. He hesitated, then added, I can take you. But it's risky. If Clive sees us, a sound cut him off. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the far end of the hallway. Heavy solace against polished marble. Nathan froze. His eyes widened, panic flickering across his face. That's him, he mouthed. The footsteps grew louder. Sundar's mind worked quickly. If they were caught talking here, Clive would know something was up. The hallway was too open, too exposed. Nathan instinctively stepped back, pressing himself against the wall, his tray held to his chest like a shield. Sundar remained still, his posture relaxed, though his senses sharpened like a drawn blade. And then Clive appeared. He was exactly the kind of man Sundar had pictured, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a pressed black uniform with silver buttons, his hair combed back with precision. His face carried the expression of someone used to authority, the kind that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. Mr. Pichai, Clive said, his tone smooth but carrying an undercurrent of something colder. This isn't part of the house where we usually see our guests. His gaze shifted to Nathan, lingering just long enough to make the younger man's shoulders stiffen. I was just having a word with your colleague, Sundar replied evenly. He was telling me about his work here. Clive's lips curled into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nathan has plenty of work to get back to. Glasses won't clear themselves. Nathan swallowed, then muttered, "Yes, sir," before moving quickly past Clive, disappearing into the main hall. Sundar noticed that he didn't look back. Once they were alone, Clive stepped closer, just enough to narrow the air between them. "You seem like a smart man, Mr. Pichai," he said softly, almost politely. "So I'll give you some friendly advice. Enjoy the party. Stay in the main hall. Some parts of the house aren't for guests." There was no threat in his tone, but the meaning was sharp as a knife. He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the hum of the distant music. Sundar stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle again. But his mind was anything but still. The glittering evening had just taken on a darker shape, and he now understood that Arthur Kane's party was more than just a social playground for the rich dotted. It was also a cage, and Sundar had no intention of staying in the part of the cage that was meant for him. Asterisk behind the velvet curtain, Sundar returned to the main hall. But his mind wasn't on the laughter, the music, or the shimmering glasses of champagne that floated past him on silver trays. He moved through the crowd like a man on autopilot, nodding politely to greetings, his smile faint but distant. Every laugh around him sounded hollow now. Every glittering jewel felt like a cruel distraction from the truth he had just heard. Somewhere in this grand estate, hidden in its quietest corridors, a young woman, Nathan's sister, was living like a prisoner while her captors toasted under chandeliers worth more than an entire neighborhood. Arthur Kane stood in the center of the room again, surrounded by a fresh circle of admirers. He was telling a story, his voice booming, his gestures grand. Sundar wondered how many of these people knew what really happened in the darker corners of this house, and how many preferred not to know. Sundar let his gaze wander without moving, his head scanning for any gaps in the security flow. Clive had made it clear he didn't want Sundar exploring the restricted areas, which only confirmed that was exactly where Sundar needed to go. He noticed that waiters and staff used a small door near the back of the hall, partially concealed behind a heavy velvet curtain. Each time the door opened, he caught glimpses of stainless steel counters, narrow corridors, and quick-moving staff disappearing into the shadows. When the crowd's attention shifted to a group of dancers brought in to perform, Sundar slipped toward the curtain, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged everywhere he walked. The music rose, drowning the soft click of the door as he slid through. The change was immediate. Dawn was the golden glow of chandeliers and polished marble. Here, the lighting was dim, the air cooler, smelling faintly of detergent and cooking oil. The corridor was narrow, lined with storage rooms and utility doors. The walls were plain, functional, a stark contrast to the opulence outside. A pair of kitchen staff passed him, their eyes briefly flicking toward him in surprise before they lowered their heads and kept walking. Sundar didn't stop them. He didn't want questions, not yet. He kept moving, listening for anything that might guide him toward Nathan's sister. A faint humming sound drew his attention. Not mechanical, but human. A soft voice, singing under its breath. Sundar followed it, turning into another hallway that sloped slightly downward. Here, the air grew cooler still, and the faint smell of damp stone crept in. The voice stopped suddenly. Sundar paused. From behind a half-open door to his left, he heard the muffled clink of metal against ceramic. He pushed the door open a little more and found himself looking into a cramped laundry room. Machines rumbled in the corner, and in the middle of the room stood a young woman, folding linens with quiet precision. She was thin, her posture slightly hunched from long hours of work. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, and her clothes were plain and worn. When she glanced up, her eyes widened in shock at the sight of him. "Are you?" Sundar hesitated, not wanting to startle her further. Are you Nathan's sister? Her lips parted, but no sound came out for a moment. Finally, she nodded. Just once. My name is Sundar, he said gently. Nathan told me about you. He's worried? A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Relief, fear, disbelief, but it was gone as quickly as it came. You shouldn't be here, she said in a low voice, glancing toward the hallway. If Clive finds you, I'm not. Leaving without making sure you're safe, Sundar interrupted softly. How long have you been here? She looked down at her hands, twisting the corner of a folded sheet. 8 months. They promised me work. Enough to send money back. Home. But they keep adding to what they say I owe. Food, lodging, uniforms. Every week the number gets bigger, not smaller. She swallowed. And when I ask about leaving, they tell me to remember that there are worse jobs in worse places. They say I should be grateful. Sundar felt a tightness in his chest. Do you have your passport? Her laugh was bitter and short. They took it the first day. Before he could respond, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. She froze, her eyes going wide. Sundar knew without asking that it was Clive Dot in an instant. She turned toward a narrow side door at the back of the laundry room. Quick! In here? She whispered urgently. Sundar followed her through, stepping into a storage space barely big enough for 2 people to stand in. The door closed silently, plunging them into near darkness. Through a thin crack, he could see the laundry room. Clive entered, his eyes sweeping the space with the cold precision of a man who trusted no one. He walked slowly around the room, his gaze lingering on the machines, the folded linens, the single glass of water sitting on the counter. Have you seen anyone? He asked sharply. The woman's voice was steady, though Sundar could hear the tension in it. No, sir. Clive studied her for a long moment, as though trying to detect a lie, then gave a small, humorless smile. Good. Keep it that way. He left without another word. The woman waited until the footsteps faded, then opened the door. Her hands were shaking. You need to go back to the main hall, she said quickly. If he finds you here again, I'm not leaving you here, Sundar said firmly, his voice low but resolute. If we wait, they'll just keep finding ways to keep you. There's a way out, we just have to plan it right. Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she whispered, there is one way. But it's dangerous, and if we fail, it won't just be me they punish. Sundar leaned closer. Tell me. She glanced toward the hallway again, then lowered her voice to a whisper so faint he had to lean in to catch it. They keep all the passports in a safe, and the key is with Arthur Kane, asterisk. The key to freedom. Sundar stood still for a long moment, the woman's words hanging in the air like a live wire. The passports. The safe. Arthur Kane had the key. It wasn't just a detail. It was the heart of the entire trap. Without those passports, there was no escape, no proof, no way to free her or anyone else Clive was keeping here. How often do you see Arthur? Sundar asked quietly. Her gaze dropped. Rarely. He doesn't come down here. When I do see him, it's only when he's walking through the main hall or when he comes to inspect the staff before big events. He never speaks to us, not unless it's to give orders through Clive. She hesitated, then added, the safe is in his private study. Upstairs, you can't get in without the key. And you can't get the key without getting close to him. Close to him. Sundar knew that meant going right back into the lion's den, walking into Arthur's circle as though nothing was wrong. It would require timing, precision, and complete control of his expression. He looked at her again. If I can get that key, will you be ready to leave tonight? She swallowed, glancing toward the laundry room door as if expecting Clive to appear again. Yes, but there's more than just me. There are others, 2 women, 1 man. All with the same story, all with their passports in that safe. Sundar felt the weight deepen. This wasn't just about 1 life. It was about 4. He nodded slowly. Then we'll get them all out. For a moment, her eyes glistened with something. Between hope and disbelief. Why are you doing this? She whispered. He gave a faint smile. Because power means nothing if you don't use it to help someone who can't help themselves. When Sundar slipped back into the main hall, the noise and light hit him all at once. Music swelling, laughter spilling over, glasses clinking. It was almost dizzying. This sudden return to excess and performance after the shadows of the service halls that Arthur Kane was near the center, standing in his usual circle of admirers. His posture was loose, confident, a man entirely comfortable in his kingdom. The gold glint of a chain at his waist caught Sundar's eye. The key dot it hung there casually. As if it was nothing more than an accessory, its small metallic gleam half hidden under the edge of Arthur's tailored jacket. Sundar's pulse quickened, though his face remained calm. Arthur saw him and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. Ah, there he is. My man of the hour, Arthur said loudly, clapping a hand on Sundar's shoulder. We were just talking about you. Someone here was saying you might actually be the most disciplined man in the room. Sundar chuckled lightly. Discipline is just another word for patience, he replied. And patience is what gets you the result you want. Arthur grinned, clearly amused. I like that. Come, have a drink with me. As they moved toward a quieter corner of the hall, Sundar studied the chain again, memorizing its position, its weight, the way it shifted when Arthur moved. Getting close enough to take it without notice would be nearly impossible with so many eyes around. Nearly, Arthur poured them both drinks, leaning in to share an anecdote about a recent yacht trip. Sundar listened, nodding at the right moments, while his mind worked quickly. Distractions, he would need one. Something big enough to pull Arthur's attention away, even for a few seconds. The opportunity came faster than expected. A sudden commotion erupted near the stage. A loud crash of glass, followed by a sharp yelp. Guests turned instinctively, their attention pulled toward the noise. Arthur's head snapped up, his focus shifting completely toward the disturbance. It was only a moment. But Sundar's hand moved with quiet precision, brushing the edge of Arthur's jacket as though adjusting his stance, and the key was gone, resting in Sundar's palm. Hidden in the fold of his sleeve, Arthur muttered something about incompetent staff and excused himself to investigate. Sundar slipped into the crowd, his pace unhurried, his expression unbothered. But inside, adrenaline surged like a storm once he was back near the velvet curtain. He stepped through without hesitation, retracing his path through the service corridors. Nathan was waiting near the laundry room, his expression tense. You got it? Nathan whispered. Sundar opened his hand just enough for the dull golden shape of the key to catch the light. Nathan's eyes widened. Where's your sister? Sundar asked. Nathan single quotes, his voice was quick, urgent. With the others? Downstairs in the supply quarters? They've been keeping to their rooms tonight. Clive is making rounds, so we have to be careful. Together they moved deeper into the maze of hallways, the walls narrowing, the air growing cooler. Each footstep echoed in Sundar's ears, each shadow felt sharper. When they reached the bottom of a short staircase, they found the hallway that ended in a locked door, the one Nathan had described. Sundar slid the key into the lock, his hands steady despite the pounding in his chest. The click of the mechanism was quiet but final. Inside, the room was dim and smelled faintly of paper and metal. Against one wall sat a heavy safe, its steel surface dull and cold. Sundar crossed the room, crouched, and took the key into the lock. It turned with a low, mechanical groan. The door swung open to reveal a stack of small, worn passports. Not just 4, but at least a dozen. Each one was a life held in place by a lock and a man's arrogance. Nathan's voice was barely a whisper. You found them all. Before Sundar could respond, the sound of boots on concrete echoed from the hallway outside. Clive. The reckoning. Sound of boots grew louder, each step hitting the concrete floor like a countdown. Sundar froze for a fraction of a second, his mind running through options at lightning speed. Nathan's eyes darted to the open safe, then to the door. They both knew if Clive caught them here, with the key and the passports, there would be no smooth talking their way out. Sundar quickly scooped up the passports, tucking them into the inside pocket of his jacket. The weight of them felt heavier than paper. They carried the lives, the hope, and the freedom of every person trapped in this house. He handed the key back to Nathan. "Put it back where it was," he whispered. Nathan, single quotes. His face was pale. "And you, I'll buy us time." The boots stopped just outside the door. Then came the slow turn of the handle. Clive stepped into the room, filling the doorway with his broad frame. His eyes swept the space, landing on the open safe and then on Sundar. For a moment, there was silence. "You've been busy," Clive said finally, his voice low and deliberate. Sundar's posture was calm, almost casual, but his eyes were locked on Clive's. "You've been running something in this house that goes beyond exploitation," he said quietly. "You've been holding people here against their will, and now—" He tapped the inside of his jacket where the passports were hidden. "It's over." Clive's lips twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl. "You think a man like you can walk into my world and change the rules? You don't understand how deep this runs." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor toward Sundar. "Give me what you took, now." But Sundar didn't move. "You're right," he said, his tone measured. "I don't know how deep this runs, but I do know one thing. There's always someone watching. And if you lay a hand on me, they'll see exactly what kind of man you are." Clive's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. "Who's watching?" Sundar took a slow step forward, closing the gap between them. "Every camera in this place," he said evenly, "and every guest out there who thinks this is just another glamorous party. What do you think will happen when they see you dragging me out of here?" For a moment, Clive's jaw tightened. The calculation was visible in his eyes. The risk of exposure. The possibility of scandal. Then, from the hallway, a voice called out sharply. "Clive?" Arthur Kane stepped into view. His gaze swept over the scene. Clive, standing rigid. Sundar, calm but unyielding. The open safe in the background. "What's going on here?" Arthur asked, his tone light but edged. With suspicion. Sundar didn't hesitate. "I was looking for the truth," he said, his voice carrying just enough for it to echo faintly in the corridor. "And I found it. You have people here who've been kept against their will, and their passports were in that safe." A ripple of unease passed over Arthur's face, quickly masked by a practiced smile. "You're making quite an accusation, Sundar." "It's not an accusation," Sundar replied, stepping past Clive and into the hallway. "It's a fact. And unless these people are free by the time this party ends, you won't just lose your reputation. You'll lose everything." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The low hum of the party drifted down the hallway, absurd in its normalcy. Finally, Arthur's smile faltered. He glanced at Clive. "Let them go," he said quietly. Clive's shoulders stiffened. "Arthur? I said, let them go." This time the words were harder, colder. And just like that, the air shifted. Nathan appeared from the far end of the hall, his sister and the others trailing behind him. Their faces were a mix of confusion and disbelief, as if freedom was something they didn't quite dare to trust. Sundar walked beside them, leading them up the narrow staircase toward the service exit. Outside, the cool, light air hit like a wave. For the first time that evening, the lights of the estate seemed far away, their golden glow powerless against the darkness beyond the gates. A car waited, not one of the limousines from the party, but a simple black van Nathan had arranged earlier. The group climbed in, and Nathan's sister paused at the door. Turning to Sundar, "You didn't have to do this," she said softly.